All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Title IX and ADA from College to Career. This is the January webinar in a monthly series hosted by Aspen's Alumni and Career Services. My name is Allie, and I'm your Alumni and Career Services Specialist. You can find upcoming events and see more resources we have to offer on our website, which I will drop into the chat shortly. This webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to Aspen's YouTube channel, and I'll put the link for that in the chat as well. Please be sure to keep your microphones muted until the end, but feel free to type questions or comments in the chat throughout, and we'll do some Q&A at the end. There is a small change in today's presentation. Liz Fernandez is unable to make it, but fortunately, we do still have Cecilia Howard. Cece is our regulatory specialist who heads up the Accessibility Services Department, and she'll be taking us through Title IX and ADA. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, Cece, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me on the Alumni and Career Services to present this information. Like she said, Liz Fernandez is not here. So I am going to go through ADA first. Liz, was going to be presenting on Title IX, and I do have her slides. So I'm going to go through those as well. Like she said, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat at any time. I don't mind to stop and answer questions, but there is a slide at the end that I can also go through any questions with you guys. So let me share my screen. Can you guys see this presentation?
Yep,
slide?
I can see it.
Awesome. So yep, there's my name and my email in case you guys should need that after, if you have any questions about the content. So I'll just dive in. So this is also sort of going through what I do. I'm a regulatory specialist for Aspen, but most of what I do is ADA, and then I also assist with the Title IX stuff. So ADA, accessibility and welfare, is what I do. And what that means is, we work with students with disabilities, any temporary conditions, pregnancy and postpartum status, and religious observations. So if I clicked here, it would go to the policy page. You guys are, feel free to check that out on your own. We won't go through the whole policy, but basically it just goes over, how to apply for disability accommodations, which we are going to go over anyways. In addition to that, it kind of goes through, pregnancy and postpartum requirements and religious observations, how to apply for those accommodations. These are all mandated by the government. So we don't really make up anything. And we just go based on, what we're mandated to do from those laws. So what is a disability under ADA? You might be wondering, what constitutes an accommodation for college or your career. So ADA is defined as a person with a disability, as somebody who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities, or somebody who has a history or record of an impairment. A good example of this would be somebody who has had cancer, who is now in remission. So they might not be considered as someone with an active disability, but they have had a disability diagnosis. They have a record of it, and they can apply for accommodations based on that status. And again, we'll get into this a little bit deeper in a minute. But this is not, this is a legal definition, so it's not a medical or social justice related definition. Just pointing that out there. Okay, so ADA 101, reasonable accommodations are set by the industry or the government, basically, which must be made available to. So this is sort of, I'm going through career and college wise, a qualified applicant. So a student applying for college with a disability or applying for a job. Qualified employees with disabilities. So in the workforce, also in higher education. Any employee with a disability, part-time or full-time, even a probationary position can apply for accommodations under disability ADA. And then qualified employees with a record of substantially limiting impairment. So that I kind of touched on temporary conditions that we do here at our school, and most schools do, most employers do. That can be anyone who has schedule change or just follow-up medical appointments. Another example, again, is cancer if you're, going for chemotherapy. But even, in the school basis, it can be something as small as a broken finger or a broken hand, if you need temporary accommodations, just for those doctor's appointments or just until your arm gets better, things like that. And then 3 categories of reasonable accommodations for the career field. Modifications or adjustments needed during the hiring process. So say, you're supposed to set up a Zoom interview, you can ask for an alternative if that's something that you're not able to do. That's just one example. If you need, or vice versa, if you need to go in person, if they're asking you to travel somewhere for the interview process, you are able to ask for alternatives there. Modifications or adjustments to the work environment. This can mean remote work. This can mean the first floor rather than the 3rd floor, things like that. To the manner or circumstances under which the position held or desired is customary. Performed modifications or adjustments that enable the enjoyment of equal benefits and privileges of employment. So those are just some categories or some explanations of reasonable accommodations. But basically under ADA, it is the duty of either a higher education setting or career setting to provide a reasonable accommodations, again, set by the industry. That's a statutory requirement. Reasonable accommodation is any change or adjustment to a job or work environment that permits a qualified applicant or employee with a disability to participate in the job application process, to perform the essential functions of a job, or to enjoy benefits and privileges of employment equal to those enjoyed by employees without disabilities. So when you go to school at Aspen, you actually sign something in the application process. I don't know if you guys are aware of this or not, but it is an essential functions form. And basically what that means is you're signing off saying that you can meet the functions or the duties required to get this degree. So for Aspen, that can be things like completing your work online, submitting it, reading, writing, things like that. The same thing applies to the career field. So if your job requires you to be on the computer, if it requires you to read, to sit, stand, if it's an in-person job, it might be a physical requirement like lifting and carrying more than 50 pounds, things like that can be on the essential functions list. So these are things that if you're not able to do, you can request accommodations for. Now, you can't necessarily change the essential functions depending on how it relates to your job. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. But that's what accommodations are there for, to equal the playing field, if you will, for somebody who has a disability. And then ADA is also duty to provide reasonable accommodations is ongoing. There's no limit to the number of requests that must be considered. So, both higher education and career field, you can request accommodations at any time. There's no limit to the number of accommodations you can ask for. So say you ask for accommodations in the beginning of your program or your career, and then you get a year into it and your condition might change. So your disability might change, and you can then ask for more accommodations there. Or maybe the program of your choice or your career changes a bit. And then again, you might have to ask for more accommodations. So just know that that is always an option to ask for more. It doesn't mean you're going to get approved for more, but that is always an option for you to change your accommodations. So students with disabilities who receive accommodations in higher education should be knowledgeable about disability disclosure and requesting and negotiating reasonable accommodations under Title I of the Americans Act, ADA, when transitioning from college to career. So for career only, this is private employers of 15 or more employees have to provide accommodations. State and local governments, regardless of the number of employees, and employment agencies and labor unions, all are mandated by the federal government to accommodate. Prohibits disability-based discrimination in all employment practices. Discrimination is prohibited against qualified individuals with disabilities. Requires reasonable accommodations for known disability of a qualified applicant or employee bearing undue hardship. Kind of went over that. Eligibility of accommodations. To qualify to receive accommodations under ADA, an individual must have a disability or a record of a disability. We kind of talked about that, what constitutes as a disability. Again, that's going to be the same for higher education and the career field. What medical impairment that substantially limits your major life activity. So questions, does or did the employee have an impairment? If yes, does the impairment affect a major life activity? And did the impairment substantially limit the life activity? So these are things that your employer will probably, think of and go over when you begin that application process. Practical guidance. So definition of, we talked about that. It can be interpreted broadly. Employers are encouraged to process accommodation requests and determine reasonable accommodations or an undue hardship. Okay, employer facts. Do not have to provide accommodations unless needed because of a qualifying disability. So this actually applies to both, not just employers, but if you're applying for an accommodation and you don't qualify as a disability, they don't necessarily have to provide any accommodations. So, you might be applying for a disability accommodation when your condition is temporary. They don't have to register you for ADA services if that's the case. So just be aware of that. Again, you'll have to go back to that definition of what a disability is. But if you meet that requirement, they do have to provide accommodations. Do not have to provide accommodations that pose an undue hardship, significant difficulty, or expense. So that can kind of be, they don't have to, I think this is somewhere else, but they don't have to, do not have to provide personal use items needed in accomplishing daily activities, both on and off the job. So if you say need a cane to walk into work, your job does not have to give you that. If you have an impairment for sight and you need a magnifying glass or something to make your computer screen bigger or reading material bigger, your employer does not always have to provide that. So that's something worth noting if you're asking for a physical object or something to utilize in person in the career field and in higher education. Depending on what it is, they may not provide that to you. So just be aware of that. Do not have to provide accommodations. Yep, we talked about that. Significant expense. Can choose among effective accommodations. So you may ask for one thing and they'll grant you another thing. An example of that in higher education is you may ask to use Grammarly to utilize your papers, and you want the school to pay for that Grammarly membership. But we have an account with Kurzweil 3000, which is similar but a different program. we can offer you the Kurzweil because we have an account with them. So we're giving you an accommodation, but it may just be an alternative to what you're really asking for. But it's still accomplishing the accommodation there. So the career field can do the same thing. You do not have to accommodate an individual who is not otherwise qualified for the position, and do not have to remove essential functions, create new jobs, or lower production standards. So this just comes down to, is your request reasonable? Given the essential functions for your job, if you're asking for an accommodation that sort of eliminates a whole aspect of your job that you have to do, same in higher education, you may not be provided that accommodation because you're basically asking for an alternative that relieves you of that job duty, or makes it so that you're not meeting the requirements of that job or the program. So this is kind of the biggest difference, I think, when it comes to higher education and career, is the disability disclosure. So the first slide, I talked about the policy, and if you go to Aspen's website, you can find our request form for accommodations. It's like a 2-page form for you to fill out, a student, and then 1 page for your treatment provider or your doctor to fill out. Alternatively, you can just bring us recent documentation. And that's pretty much our disclosure process, is the request itself. In the career field, that's a bit different. And in higher education, you can do that at any time. It doesn't have to be upon applying, it can be. But for disabilities in the career field, it's a little bit different. So why should you disclose for a career? You should do that to ask for job accommodations, to receive benefits or privileges of employment, and to explain an unusual circumstance. So that can be like you needing time off, or you need FMLA. That could be a benefit that you're seeking because of a disability. It's not necessary to share everything about the disability and its effects, but there is some information that you might want to share, which is how a disability impacts the capacity to learn and perform effectively, what adjustments, supports, and services you may need in your job to have access to participate in or excel in your employment. But tips here, you don't have to disclose too soon. So there are, on the most applications now, ask if you have a disability. And you actually don't have to disclose during that time. You can, you certainly can. They cannot discriminate against you because you select that you have a disability on that application, but you don't have to do it then. But alternatively, don't disclose too late. So if your performance is suffering or you're struggling at work, you've probably waited too long to disclose that you do have a disability. So know when to disclose and how to disclose. So if you need an adjustment or a change at work for a reason related to your medical condition, or who to disclose to, go to HR. Go to your recruiter who maybe, led you to this job, or your manager if you're in the position. But you don't have to disclose to everyone, and that's the same in higher education and in the career field. Really just the person that you're applying for the accommodations with are the only people that need to know. With that being said, if you apply for accommodations in a career through HR, they will most likely notify your manager, but it depends on what the accommodation is for. Like if you need time off, your boss needs to know. If you need, to leave early for appointments, things like that, your boss needs to know. So who they disclose it to will vary based on the condition. But they will also notify you that they are going to be disclosing your disability status to somebody in the workforce. They will not, in higher education and in the career field, your disability itself is never disclosed. So in higher education, that may look like me telling a faculty what your accommodations are and that you're registered for services because you have a disability, but it will not be, hey, this person has this disability and these are the accommodations that they have. So that is the same across the board. Generally, employers may not require applicants to disclose information about a disability prior to an offer of employment. So kind of went over that. What is meant by reasonable when we're talking about accommodations, feasible? The employer or university gets to decide based on those essential functions, again, that we kind of already talked about. Must be an effective accommodation and will not pose an undue hardship for the employer or the university. And when we say undue hardship, it for higher education, that looks like maybe a faculty working way overtime to read your papers 3 weeks after a course ends. Like that's unreasonable to ask in most cases. For an employer, that can be, you know, spending a bunch of money to put in an elevator because you have to work on the 3rd floor. Likely they'll just move you to the 1st floor, things like that, or remote work based on what is a hardship for that institution or that career or employer. I already skipped ahead. What is undue hardship? Significant difficulty or expense. This is case by case, kind of what I was saying. What if the individual isn't sure what accommodations are needed? So this happens in higher education. I have students all the time that say, you know, I was diagnosed with this and I don't know what accommodations would help me. So that can happen in the career field as well. So what I always tell the student is, you know, tell me what you know about your condition, how it impairs you. This would be the same in the career field. You know, what are you struggling with your job? What is the impairment or job related issue that you're running into? And then you can explore ideas. And we call that the interactive process. So for higher education, that's typically me getting on the phone with the student, going through, hey, you know, what you're struggling with. This is what I can offer. This is what sounds like it would help you, behoove you in the program, what we can provide during this program. So, and that's the same thing for a career field. What if an accommodation request is denied? So we do deny accommodations and careers do as well. That happens frequently, really. What I recommend is to ask more information about the denial. Why was it denied? Provide additional information or offer alternative solutions. So most likely if it's denied, you will receive information of why it's denied. And then you can rebuttal that, right? And say, oh, well, you're saying I can't have this accommodation, but what about this? You know, try to meet in the middle. And then you can also look into internal complaint options. So in the higher education, we have a grievance process. So you would appeal that decision if you wanted to. And it's the same in the career field. You're able to file a complaint. So here's where Liz was going to be talking about Title IX. So we're going to transition out of ADA and into Title IX, but I guess this would probably be good to ask if anyone has questions about the ADA stuff before we get started on Title IX.
I have a quick question just out of curiosity, as it might come up frequently with students. Does ADA apply to individuals who are caretakers of those with disabilities, or just the individual who has the disability?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's just the individual who has a disability. So we do actually get that kind of frequently, which is like I'm taking care of my dad who's having issues with, you know, his health, or my son, or whatever it may be. and they do not meet the requirement for accommodations. So it's the same in the career field. Career field is a little bit, I think you can still take your family medical leave. So there are more options actually in the career field that to help you if you're having, if you need time off to help a family member, things like that, than in higher education. But to qualify for ADA services, no,
Okay,
you
thank
wouldn't
you.
meet that requirement.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so then for a student in that case, my advice would be to make sure to talk to your advisor and communicate about what's going on. And if you need help course planning or deciding how much time you need off, definitely use your advisor as a resource there.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess while we're kind of talking about this, I didn't really go through the religious and pregnancy stuff because that is not technically ADA. Our office does it, but it's not ADA. It is actually the pregnancy postpartum accommodations are covered under Title IX. So you're still going to apply the same way in higher education for either a religious or pregnancy postpartum accommodation, with just a request form and maybe some documentation. But the accommodations are totally different, and it's just very different as far as what kind of accommodations you can get and what your protections are. So in the career field, that is also separate, but you'll still go through HR. You still have access to resources for both pregnancy, postpartum, and religious accommodations. So just a side note about that. All right, so for Title IX, the definition of Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 prohibits discrimination based on sex in federally funded education programs or activities. So the scope, this applies to students, faculty, staff, and volunteers in higher education institutions receiving federal funds. Key protections are it covers sexual harassment, assault, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. Before I go any further, I'll just say, Liz Fernandez, who's not here, is the Title IX coordinator, and I am the Title IX investigator. So we'll get into that, but there are different roles within an institution and career for Title IX coverage. So key provisions of Title IX, sexual harassment types. There is quid pro quo. Employment or education decisions tied to sexual favors, hostile environment, which is conduct creating an intimidating or offensive environment, and then equity in athletics and employment ensures equal opportunities for all genders in sports and workplace settings. Title IX reporting and procedures. So there's reporting channels, which are clear options for reporting sexual misconduct, including anonymous reports. So here at the institution, we do have a policy on Title IX. Within that policy, you will find how to report Title IX. And we have an email address, title9@aspen.edu. That is checked daily by myself and Liz Fernandez. And then we have alternative options for that anonymous reports. A role of coordinators, so to oversee compliance and training, manage investigations, and provide resources. Supportive measures include interim accommodations like counseling, schedule adjustments, or housing changes. The housing changes doesn't really apply to our institution because we're remote. But if we were an in-person institution, that is something that can be provided. Legal protections against sexual harassment in the workplace. So this is covered by federal laws. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits workplace sexual harassment and retaliation. Then there's the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which enforces anti-harassment laws and investigates complaints. State laws, many states require mandatory sexual harassment prevention training. I believe we offer that as well to our students, but that is definitely something that happens in the career field. Mandatory training requirements. Annual training. Employers must provide interactive training on identifying and preventing harassment in the workplace. Supervisors often require additional training hours. And then the content of these trainings is definitions, examples, reporting procedures, and bystander intervention strategies. So it's most likely that everybody on here has done some sort of Title IX training before, either when you got a job or when you started school. And it's just to make people aware of what that looks like, what it sounds like. And that is something that is mandated. We provide employer obligations. Written policies, clear anti-harassment policies must be distributed to all employees. Complaint mechanisms, employers must establish confidential reporting channels and investigate complaints promptly. And then preventative measures, regular updates to policies and reinforcement through leadership communication. These are employer obligations, but this is also actually done at the school level. So in higher education, this is something that Liz and I do every year. Employee rights and accountability. Employee protections, protection from retaliation for reporting harassment, right to a safe harassment-free workplace, employer accountability. Failure to act on complaints can result in legal action or penalties, and swift corrective actions are required to address violations. So for our school in particular, we have about 7 days, I think 5 to 7 business days to respond to any report of sexual misconduct or harassment. And that can be, you know, if you just feel that your workplace is a hostile environment, so you're uncomfortable, someone's making you uncomfortable at work. It doesn't always have to be sexual in nature, but everyone is you know, should have access to a non-hostile work environment. So that's sort of what the hostile-free workplace means. And then obviously, if anything is sexual in nature, that definitely rises to the level for both students at a school and employees. So safe and equitable environments. Every individual deserves the right to pursue an education without fear, a workplace free from harassment and discrimination, respect and dignity, and equal opportunities. Together, we can create inclusive learning and working environments, support and empower one another, hold ourselves and others accountable. And remember, your voice matters. Speak up against harassment and protect yourself and others. So a lot of this stuff is what those trainings that are offered to both students and people in workplace. That's sort of what this goes over, which is, hey, if you see something, say something. That's really part of the biggest, you know, biggest reason Title IX is offered is if something's going wrong, you know, your school or your career, your workplace needs to know about it. I think that's it. Harassment and discrimination it's not only sexual in nature, you know, it can be any sort of discrimination. And basically, when you report to either HR or to a Title IX office in higher education, both in higher education and your career field, that complaint is going to be taken seriously. It's going to be investigated and looked into. If it doesn't rise to the level of Title IX, it can also be just considered a civil rights complaint or a grievance, a complaint in general. So I encourage you, both for school and for the career, for your career, if you're uncomfortable with something, again, say something. It can still be investigated and looked into. And then from here, you know, careers and higher education, that can sometimes rise to the level of a hearing. It can sometimes just be an investigation with some interviews. It's very case by case dependent. And the consequences are case by case dependent, based on, every situation is very, very different. So I think that's it for Title IX. Does anyone have any questions about Title IX? It's pretty similar from higher education to career. A lot of that is the same.
If anyone does have a question, definitely feel free to put it in the chat or unmute and speak up. That's absolutely fine. I did just want to take the opportunity to thank Cece. Thank you so much for taking on the whole presentation that was meant to be a double feature. I really appreciate that a lot, and it's really useful to get a refresh on this, and for some people maybe to hear about the protections for the first time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's important stuff for everybody to know. So yeah, if anyone has any personal questions, experiences that they want to share, or questions about going into the workforce, or even still for higher education, please reach out to me personally. If it's something that you don't want to ask in this space, I'm happy to answer emails, get on phone calls, or set up meetings with anybody who's interested in these topics.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Thanks again to Cece. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, but as she said, please feel free to reach out to her for ADA and Title IX questions. And you can also reach out to alumni at aspen.edu for any career development job search questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.